Welcome to Saving America. This is your host, Dr. David D. Schein. Our series of interviews for Saving America establishes that the world is full of interesting people. Once you hear from our next guest, I am sure that you will agree that they deserve the moniker of interesting persons. Saving America welcomes Ambassador Kip Tom and Royce Hood for a special panel discussion on a subject critical to the future of America. Ambassador Kip Tom is the chairman of the Tom Family Agribusinesses, president of SaraServe, and vice chairman of Farmers First and Rural Policy, American First Policy Institute. He has also been a board member of the Trump Agricultural Committee since 2015, appointed by President Trump as ambassador to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Agencies, where he served in Rome from 2019 to 2021. He holds numerous corporate board positions. Royce Hood is a senior policy analyst at America First Policy Institute. He has a BS in political science with an economics minor from Texas A&M University. He interned at the Claremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life. He is the author of Ending the Federal Government's Reliance on Chinese Technology. We welcome Ambassador Kip Tom and Royce Hood for their first appearances on Saving America.
Pleasure to be with you.
Well, we're delighted to have you. And of course, we're going to focus on a specific part of the situation about Chinese infiltration into the U.S. market, specifically in agriculture. And as you know, we ask our guests 3 questions. And since there's 2 of you, each feel free to take a shot. But what are Americans not being told about the food security in the United States?
Well, I'll go ahead and start with that. I think a lot of times we feel that we're a food secure nation, and the reality is we are not. I think if you go back in history, the last time our nation suffered from food insecurity would have been back during the Great Depression in the late 20s and the 30s. And from that point in time, we innovated, we worked our way through it, and we got to a point where now we were food secure, but then we've taken so much of our supply chains, whether it's on the input side of the products that we use that are pillars of producing crops and livestock proteins, to our output or some of the processing that goes on over to China. So I think we've always, in terms of trying to lower the cost of food, we've looked at other places around the world because of the regulatory environment in the United States. We've moved a lot of our supply chains offshore. And I say that mainly in the context as I look at crop chemistries. I look at crop care products that we use that, protect our crops from insects, diseases, and weeds. Without them, our yields would fall 50, 60%. We'd have food price inflation and we'd have global food insecurity. So we need these products, but a lot of these products are made in China. I think back to what happens if we have a war between Taiwan and China. What happens to that supply chain? Yes, we have India. India has really stepped up and they continue to grow their sector to produce those same products. But right now, that one main pillar that we use to, whether it's animal vaccines or medications or what we try to use to care for our crops, would be at risk. And that puts the U.S. consumer in jeopardy if something like that would happen. So I'm a big believer in trying to onshore much of that back to the United States as we can. I believe we need to have those supply chains back here or with our allies. And so I'm here to tell you, we're not food secure. We may produce the raw commodities, but when it goes further down the stream or coming into those commodities, we have a problem.
And Royce, did you want to add something to that?
No, I agree with what everything Tom said. Just say that the historical problem, I would say, of the 21st century is that America has always underestimated the risk of offshoring, in particular to China. The geopolitical risk of things going to China has always been understood and undervalued. And I think as we've entered the 21st century, that much has become apparent, and so we're reckoning with those consequences.
Well, Ambassador Tom, you hit on an interesting side note, which I think is something that people have really not tuned into, and that was veterinary medicine and vaccinations, because obviously we need healthy livestock, but I didn't realize that we were dependent on other countries to provide that.
Well, what happens is we may develop the intellectual property here, but the manufacturing of that pharmaceutical product that's used to keep an animal healthy when they get sick, we've offshored it. And they came in producing it for less cost than what we could do it here in the United States. So a lot of major companies went over there and had the production done there. And I think that could come back to us someday and really haunt us in the future. And I really encourage when I get in front of these companies that are producing these different vaccines, pharmaceutical products, those producing crop care products, those producing computer chips that run our tractors and run the computers on our farms and make us more efficient and protect the environment and help our workers get their work done. They're also produced there. And so this is where it's time for America to roll up their sleeves, figure out how we're going to invest the capital and how we're going to bring these supply chains back home.
Well, you touch on an interesting issue in terms of contract, developing the important intellectual property, the IP here, but then contracting out the construction or the manufacturing. And of course, one of the most vivid examples, which ended up in one of the largest uh, lawsuits in history, was that Apple, of course, developed the smartphone, basically the iPhone, but they don't have a factory. They're building their first factory right now, and they went and had Samsung build the phones. And even though it's technically through Japan, it's actually, I think a lot of the manufacturing was actually done physically in China. And then a few years later, Samsung came out with its smartphone, and all of a sudden it was like, oh my goodness, this is horrible. They ripped off our IP, and of course it ended up in a big judgment. But Apple is still sharing that market with a large number of competitors, even though clearly they got out in front. So it is interesting, this issue of contract manufacturing turning into competition.
Well, it's interesting. You bring up the point on AI, and obviously Apple went over for specific reasons, obviously to reduce costs and everything. But when we think about the intellectual property that we generate here, this is what America's done so well for well over 100 years, better than most places around the globe. And when I look at the seed industry in the United States, that's one area where we've really increased productivity. So much so, I'll share this story with you. My father passed away about 4 years ago in February. And 4 days before he passed, he said, I'd like to go down to the farm one more time. We went down the farm and we visited where his cows were having baby calves and everything. And he said, well, let's go on down to the first field where you and I farmed it with together. And I remember that when I was like 5 years old, walking in the furrow behind my father with my dog, and as he plowed the field. And we sat there on a rock talking that day, and Dad made the comment. He said, well, what did this field yield this year? And I said, well, before I answer that, I'm going to ask you, what did it yield when you were a boy following your father when he plowed his field with a horse or a mule and a plow? And he said, back then we got about 30 bushels per acre. I said, so to answer your question, today we get about 240 bushels per acre. So we've had an eightfold increase in productivity gains. A lot of that is due to seed genetics and agronomic knowledge that we've got. Well, that intellectual property is constantly being threatened in the United States here, being stolen by the Chinese. We had Chinese in our fields in northern Indiana, southern Michigan, across to Illinois and into Iowa, actually out in the fields digging up the intellectual property, some of these male and female inbred lines to take back and produce in China. This is why we know that China someday will be self-sufficient within probably 5 years, we predict, self-sufficient in production of commodities like corn and soybeans. And that's because they stole our intellectual property. They were one of our largest customers in the world that we sold to in the export markets. Now, because they have our IP, they don't need us any longer. So play that across many other sectors, many other industries in the United States where they've stolen our IP. So all of a sudden, one of the world's second largest economy, all of a sudden doesn't need the United States.
Yes, and of course, I think many of our listeners are familiar with the fact that President Trump has had numerous discussions with China about honoring their commitment to buy American soybeans. But obviously, if they can fix their using our intellectual property, including genetic development of higher yielding crops of soybeans, they'll have less or no need to import soybeans from the United States.
Well, we have that going on, and then not only did they steal our intellectual property, use it in China, but China's got a major foothold in one of the largest production areas of agriculture today, and that's Brazil. We've seen what
Yes.
they've done with the Belt and Road Initiative down there. They've brought a lot of foreign direct investment in, improve infrastructure, investing in farms, investing in actually doing barter trades now. They're building a rail line from the Mato Grosso area clear across into Peru to do deep water port loading of commodities to get them into China sooner. So they've taken and used what we had against us, and even with some of our biggest competitors, which is Brazil. So um, I can't say enough. We need to make sure that we do a better job of protecting our intellectual property and keep our guard up at all times.
Absolutely. So, what is the extent of the current infiltration of the CCP into the food chain of the United States? Because, and let's talk about what's happening here in the United States with the CCP infiltration.
I'll let Royce answer that one for you.
I would focus on two particular examples just because of how kind of understated they are and the topic of the paper. First of which is Syngenta being involved in seed technology and being very well integrated into many parts of the supply chain. That one is more pernicious because it was initially a Swiss-owned company. And when the takeover happened, it went through the review process that it should have in terms of what was on the books at the time. But it was taken over by an American adversary. It's now owned by China. And you ask many people, and they don't know that that takeover ever happened. So a lot of the production that Syngenta does, a lot of that intellectual property research, all comes coming out of China. All the purchasing going to China, all the money ultimately flowing to Chinese corporate bank accounts. And I think the second one, which has a bigger impact on physically on the ground in America in terms of its footprint, is Smithfield. That
Yes.
one is more pernicious because of the locations of a lot of these farms that contract with Smithfield or Smithfields themselves own, is that it has such a large footprint. And again, Smithfield Foods not going to strike the average American as being Chinese owned, even though it went through the same purchase and acquisition process that technically at the time was appropriate. But now upwards of a quarter of the American pork market is essentially at the production and oversight whims of the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, and of course, in this current environment where beef is very expensive, more and more American families are turning to pork products. And I don't know that the average American consumer really understands what's happening with regard to that market and how easy it could be for them to withdraw production from the market, which would have dramatic effects on people, just everyday family budgets.
For sure. And there's other parts in that market that make Chinese action like that even more concerning. So, for example, when Smithfield was taken over by China, Smithfield was in the process of engaging in cartel price manipulation. So it's not as if the pork industry is sort of separate from this kind of colluding domestically where prices can be artificially inflated. Now imagine if consciously all parties involved, including a Chinese-owned Smithfield, collectively decide, like you noted, demand is going to pork. The prices are low by comparison. Let's squeeze as much as we can out of it. And again,
Mhm.
the CCP ownership of Smithfield does not view American consumers with any sort of fondness. It is purely extractive. It's purely for the money.
Well, and it's been interesting. I actually have I'm not a big ham or pork eater, but it's interesting to me because I have a strong connections to Virginia. It's my family home base these days, and Smithfield is a significant economic impact to the state of Virginia. I mean, it's an employer. It's a capital base, and as you indicated, a lot of the farms that feed into the Smithfield processing plants and things like that in Smithfield, Virginia, which if people don't know is located in a agricultural area in Southeast Virginia, inland from the urban center of Norfolk, Virginia Beach. So they could certainly have a big impact.
Yeah, and I think in particular to note that it is Virginia and North Carolina is important here. I mean, these are major states that have been backbones of America's military for basing and logistical support. I mean, we have things like, all the naval bases along the coast of Virginia, North Carolina, even South Carolina, down to where Smithfield does operate some properties. So with the massive land footprint that Smithfield has, and then you have to start cross-referencing. It's like, okay, now we have Smithfield owning properties that are butt up against, munitions ranges or army bases proper. These are technically properties that at the end of the day are accountable to the Chinese Communist Party. Now we have to reckon with, is this a prudent decision? I mean, are we going to evaluate every piece of property that Smithfield owns against against these bases for security risks? Is that something that we can tolerate and mitigate long term on a reasonable basis? And I think a lot of the time the answer is no.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that part because, of course, I was a military dependent. That's how I ended up in Virginia, and my father was stationed at the huge Norfolk Naval Base, which is the single most important naval military facility on the east coast of the United States. The only parallel to that, of course, is the one in San Diego, California, on the west coast. So it's absolutely close. And of course, there are many military facilities spread throughout, especially Virginia, but also parts of North Carolina. How extensive, because I know there's been some discussion state by state about limiting the purchase by the CCP or anything associated with CCP of real estate near military bases across the United States.
The conversations depend a lot state by state. So obviously, states that have the larger kind of footprints of existing properties have more sensitive conversations about potentially disrupting a lot of these things. So some of these bans are only forward-looking and they have no effect on current situations, which is understandable from a disruptiveness point of view. But if we're taking into account those threats that we're facing, it's not to say that Smithfield is aiming to acquire any more land in specific proximity to military bases. That would be too overt. But we shouldn't also tolerate the existing footprint around these bases as being acceptable. So it's a very state by state case. And because of the unique nature of how these farms are contracted, they're all not on single tracts of land. They're kind of just randomly blotted over county or multi-county areas around these bases. Um, Even if it doesn't stay at the state level for concern, if you ask, a county commission what they think of this and how they feel about it on a security basis, you're going to get different answers everywhere you go because the extent to which these companies are integrated at each locality or municipality varies greatly.
Well, do you think that this is coming down to the so-called red and blue issue, where the red states might be a little bit more concerned about Chinese acquisition of real estate near military bases than the red states are?
I don't think it's strictly gotten that bad yet. I think in when it's contained to narrowly the issue of near military bases is when it generally can remain bipartisan. But when you get to more serious considerations of should there be really purchasing of property by Chinese nationals, period, who still maintain Chinese citizenship, then you see disputes like are happening in Florida and Texas when um, all restraints are kind of loosened and the fight gets really partisan very quickly, name calling on legislative floors, yelling at committee hearings. It gets very heated very quickly. I don't think that in states like North Carolina and Virginia that consider this purely on a let's start at the military base proximity level. It doesn't have to be that way, and I haven't seen it be that way quite yet.
Yeah, fascinating situation. So, what are the steps that we need to be taking right now to ensure that America controls all aspects of its food chain?
I'll give a little bit of an answer referring to USDA, but then I'll kick it to Ambassador Tom. I think that Secretary Rollins' Farm Security National Action Plan is kind of the highest level, multi-point, all-encompassing kind of survey of these problems. Is that the two biggest things it necessitates is a assessment of the supply chains themselves, because agriculture has so many different inputs that require such a long trace to truly understand what they're dependent on. And that is an industry specific, self evaluating process that experts in that field of specifically agricultural supply chains really need to come to account and say, how much are we dependent on these places that are either adversarial to the US or otherwise would be disrupted in case of any conflict? And then secondly, I think the updates to just how America tracks its own awareness of foreign owned land by nations like China. The old system called EFIDA uh, was still using paper notices and letters submitted to the USDA's headquarters in Washington, D.C. For foreign landowners who were required to report this information when they purchased farmland. It had been this way since the program's inception, and only just over this recent holiday season did they finally initiate and do a trial run of a new digital process to submit this information. This is how far behind the ball that we've been playing. So even getting to remotely modern standards on this gives us way more ability. But I'll leave the rest to Ambassador Tom.
Yeah, I'm going to take a moment. I'll agree with Royce on this. I believe Secretary Rollins and USDA focusing on food security, farm security as national security, and putting a lens on this and really monitoring what's going on. But I think it goes far beyond the obvious. And the obvious being we know when they own land, we know when they buy enterprises out in the United States. Those are the things that we're aware of. It's what we're not aware of that I'm just equally concerned about. And one of them is our digital technologies. A farm like ours will produce nearly a terabyte of data per year. And that's intellectual property that increases our productivity. But there's so many other forms of intellectual property that are produced on America's farms and the vast industries across our nation. I think as a country, oftentimes we take that for granted and we think that everybody is playing by the same rules. And I really worry about whether it's on our farms, whether it's automobile manufacturing, whether it's you name the industry. I think we're a much greater risk than what we perceive we are today. And I hope we can, as a nation, come together. I don't care if you're a blue state or you're a red state. I think we need to come together and figure out how do we stop this and make sure that we remain safe. China has one goal, and they want to be the dominant power in the world. And the way they get that is through economic strength. We know that I learned this when going through some of the schooling I did before I went to serve as ambassador is there's four pillars of strength. One's our ability to conduct diplomatic operations around the world, either averting or making sure we find a solution for some kind of issue that's going on in a nation we represent or we're represented in. The next one is our ability to have the best informational resources in the world to make sure we make good choices. The third is economic superiority. We have to be strong economically. And the fourth is all, of course, having a strong military and not being afraid to use it when we have to. But I always say there's a fifth. That fifth leg of that is food security, because without food, nothing else exists. And I think we really need to focus in on agriculture, make sure that we have our supply chains tightened up to the point we're not losing the intellectual property we need to make sure we're a global leader in supplying agriculture products throughout the world.
Well, it sounds like very good advice. And of course, maybe when you talk with Secretary Rollins, you can share that when President Trump gives his speech and talks about the need for pharmaceuticals to be produced in this country. And I think we all saw this during COVID-19 when we ran out of chips and we ran out of prescriptions and even a lot of generics were simply unavailable, even though they're very easy to produce and they can be produced with mechanized situations. But perhaps to have President Trump broaden his message there and say, in addition to pharmaceutical supply chains, to include food supply chains.
Yeah, and it's not going to be easy. I mean, we think that we're the most advanced in manufacturing, but the Chinese have taken this opportunity on our dime, a lot of times other intellectual property, to develop the most advanced manufacturing plants in the world, especially when I look at those that are producing the crop chemistries that we use on our farm today. Massive plants that maybe only have 5 employees in that plant at any one time. Everything's computerized, robotics control everything. The volume that they can kick out is much higher than anything we have here in the United States. Which leads me to this next point here, and this is a little bit where Royce was talking about, it was in his conversation with Syngenta. it's how do we hold companies like this that are in the United States accountable to make sure that we're protecting the U.S. interest here? Syngenta, as an example, probably has thousands of employees in the United States. They probably have the most significant crop care, chemistry, pesticide manufacturing in the United States. So how do we make sure that we maintain that productivity here, yet see some kind of breakdown between the chain of custody between the United States and the CCP? That's where I think we have to do. We have to break them apart to where we have a U.S. company and they have their Chinese company. And of course, there's always going to be lots of discussion on where does the money flow. And I think this is where we need to show our strength.
Well, hopefully we're going to see that development in the future, and I think President Trump has been on the right trail in terms of encouraging development of manufacturing. And I think the new manufacturing that we're building in the United States, I think, is going to meet those high technology standards. As the I hate to use the term AI frivolously, but the reality is that we're going to be developing plants and that will operate with fewer people and hopefully more efficiency and being built brand new, like the Apple is, of course, famously building its first factory ever. Right here in the United States, is that we will do better at controlling our intellectual property and also being more secure by being able to produce onshore what we need to keep going, even if there is a major disruption like another COVID-19 or, God forbid, some type of mega war action.
You know, we talk about these big companies here, but there's a lot of other ways they're infiltrating and capturing information. And I know Royce had some of it in the paper that we released back last fall, but one of them is in drone manufacturing. China has been very instrumental in supporting through subsidies to their own drone manufacturers, and they bring actually some of the best technologies to the US at a very discounted price compared to what we get built here in the United States. So you have these drones that are downloading to the DJI platform, which is controlled by China, and all of a sudden, just think about all the images, aerial images that are captured by the CCP. Now, some people could easily say that, well, that really doesn't make a difference. Well, it does. Everything you can collect will make a difference someday. So I hope that using that as an example, I hope we can look at other manufacturing supply chains in the United States here that are subject to countering these subsidies that are going in, that's happening in China, and we get back here to producing in the United States. I'll pay a premium to buy something from the United States as opposed to buying anything from China. And I hope more
Well,
people feel that way too.
I certainly feel that way, and I have expressed frustration to my colleagues and friends is that it's overwhelming what is made in China. I mean, it's printed right on the box, it's printed on the item, and as an American and as a patriotic American and someone who's concerned about the future of America and our children, our grandchildren, is to really make sure that we begin making products. And I think many Americans feel like you and I do, that they would pay more to get a good quality item made here in the United States. And I don't mean just China. I mean also, as a cliche out there, they talk about knives and they say, oh, the sharpest knife is coming from Germany or something like that. And I want people to say, this is a fabulous set of knives made right here in the United States, and these are fabulous crops grown right here in the United States.
You know, in my years of serving as an ambassador, I spent a lot of time in Africa. And obviously, the 54 nations that are down there, most of them have some kind of an agreement with China. And I got to witness firsthand what happens when China comes in and they do contracts. Maybe it's for mining materials, maybe it's for building roads, maybe it's for power generation, transmission lines. so much, but they control the country. They'll help the country maybe even go and apply for a loan from the World Bank. But then when they default on that loan, then China comes in and buys those loans out at a very discounted price, and then they control the economy basically of that country. So when I look at Africa, that's a good place to show just exactly how they behave when they're allowed to have free reins, especially with a lot of corrupt governments that we see there. So I can only imagine, obviously they have interest, as I said earlier, of wanting to be the dominant power in the world. And so they're going to follow the populations.
Well, I agree with you, and certainly for perhaps another show, we can talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. But and I know it has led to incredible abuse of some of these countries, not necessarily third world countries, because I know that the largest port in Greece is now controlled by China due to the Belt and Road Initiative. And I was very pleased as a patriot to see that we have removed China from the Panama Canal. That there was a Chinese port set up on both ends of the Panama Canal, which they have just turned over to an American company, I think under pressure from President Trump. So I'm hoping that we're going to develop more awareness like that and maybe be more aggressive. I know part of the Trump doctrine has been to cut back on foreign aid that's being wasted on questionable programs. But I certainly think perhaps we will turn to helping countries avoid using Belt and Road and using legitimate support from the United States and other more supportive countries. And all that. Well, as you know, we try and keep these short so people will actually listen to the interview, and this has been great. How can our audience get more information about both of you and the important topic of CCP's involvement in the U.S. food chain?
Royce, I'll let you kick that off.
Good place to keep updated is our website, americafirstpolicy.com. Both our rural policy section, which deals with agriculture issues more generally, which Ambassador Tom is the co-chair. Let me get that correct, I think. And also our China Policy Initiative. My supervisor, Adam Savitt, is just returning from a 5-month stint at the USDA covering this exact issue. So expect more from us on a lot of China agriculture supply chain stuff. Both me and Adam can be found on Twitter. I know my handle are at R__Hood. I don't remember Adam's off the top of my head though, so apologies to him if he's watching this.
I would say, yeah, is Royce commented there where you need to get that relevant information. But I think I would ask people, everybody, we all have a responsibility here. You see something, say something, get in contact with somebody. I know in the last few weeks here, there's been a number of arrests at a number of universities around the country where we've had some Chinese infiltrating that could have caused some harm to the country, and they've been removed. And I hope we can continue to do that. I look forward to our law enforcement doing what they can to prevent any of these incidences from happening and becoming a bigger problem for our country. But again, as I said, you see something, say something to somebody. I know in Rome, in our embassy alone, it was hard for us to even have a conversation to discuss anything about China with, we know the surveillance that could go on around the embassy. So there's so many ways that they're very creative in trying to capture U.S. information that we all need to be involved. But the only way to be involved is make sure you're relevant and read up on what's going on. And it good starts with the policy papers that come out of AFPI.
This is Dr. David D. Schein. Thanks for joining me for this special edition of Saving America. Remember, a new Saving America show is aired on the Brushwood Media Network every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Listen on any of the 16 network stations, Apple or Google mobile app, Apple CarPlay, TuneIn, Smart Speaker, and all smart TVs. Find more information at the brushwoodmedianetwork.com. Please be sure to join us each week. We welcome and love your feedback from our growing audience.